Hi everybody, it's Cookie Lou in Arizona, and I'm here today to make a video for two reasons. First and foremost, there is several of you out there that were interested in reading my book, Family of Pearls, that I spoke about. This is the book, Family of Pearls, and it was written under my name, Lucille Albino, and some of you were wanting to know how to go about obtaining the book so you could read it. Just go to any of your large bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, whatever. Also, I think Amazon.com has it, but last I heard they had an older version of the printing. This is probably the fourth revision that I've made on the book. Understand also that I have a few books here that I can sell some people. I don't have many, but I'm more than willing to mail you a copy of the book because it takes about 10 days to 2 weeks for the publishing company to print up the books per order. So I do have a few that I can send you if you're interested. Just send me a private message with your address, and I'll send you a book. But thank you for wanting to read the book. I really appreciate that. It's a very interesting book. It's a very emotional book, and it is not boring. Trust me, it's a good read, and you won't be disappointed reading Family of Pearls. I have done a couple of readings in the past. I've read a few chapters, and people have really liked that. And I thought I would take this opportunity today, being Veterans Day, to read a chapter that I had written about my uncles and their experiences in war. But before I do that, I also want to say that many of you liked my story about my grandpa and about the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center. So I'm going to show you a picture of that first tree at Rockefeller Center. It's also in my book. A small story about that is in my book. It's called The Tree. It's called The Tree. And I have this picture in another montage that I made about my family, and you could get a real good look at it in that video. It's called A Moment in Time. And it's in my library of videos. But this is the tree in Rockefeller Center. Let me see if I can get this. I can't hold it up to the camera and see what I'm doing at the same time. But that was the first tree at Rockefeller Center. See if you can see that. And that was quite a large tree, and the men are standing in the hole of Rockefeller Center. They were just starting to do the foundation, and the paymaster is there near the tree, and he's handing out their paychecks, and some of them are eating lunch and just standing around waiting for their paychecks. And my grandfather is all the way in the back, and we got the magnifying glasses out, and I did find him all the way in the back, and I blew up a picture of him standing in the back. It's blurry as it is, but that's my grandpa. That's him. Sebastiano Mascarello, and the first tree at Rockefeller Center was his invention. And I did mention to you that the guys made the garland for the tree out of the silver paper wrappers of the from the blasting caps, and that's the garland that they put around the tree. They just kind of wanted to make it festive, and that's the only decoration they had was the silver paper from the blasting caps, and they just kind of tossed it around. And that's the first tree ceremony at Rockefeller Plaza, New York City. Okay, enough of that. What I wanted to read to you in honor of Veterans Day or Remembrance Day, and Sally did a beautiful video this morning about her experience in Wales, England, Wales, and how all the people in that village there are celebrating Remembrance Day. And it's really a big deal over there, and it's a big deal here as well. So I wanted to read a chapter from my book about my uncles who were in the war and the experiences that they had that they had, that I remember them living as a little girl. I was a little girl when they went off to war, and I remember it. And I remembered it well enough to write about it. Now, I wanted just to focus on my Uncle Armando, who was an infantry soldier in Korea in 1952 to 54. And, but not to take away from my other uncles, I decided to read the little stories I have about all three of them. And this is the one that most people seem to be interested in too, is my Uncle Carlo, who was the kissing sailor. And I'm going to read about that as well. And this is chapter 9, and it's the season of war. Uncle Sam showed up in the mailboxes all over the country informing men that they had been drafted. It seemed as if every American household had someone in the service. Every eligible man who was offered a uniform and shipped off to fight a battle in another part of the world by land, sea, or by air. Carlo was the first in the family to get his letter. Grandpa was so upset he punched the picture of Jesus right off the wall. Carlo was in the Navy, and he was shipped out to Panama. Fortunately, he was not in harm's way for very long. Ordered back to the States, he spent most of the remainder of the war anchored offshore near Staten Island, which gave him the opportunity to come home on leave often. During one of his visits, his mother told him that 2 of his close friends had been killed. One had been killed in the beaches. I might get a little weepy with this. Please forgive me. One had been killed on the beaches of Normandy during the D-Day invasion of France, and the other had been killed while fighting on the island of Iwo Jima in the Northwest Pacific. Carlo broke down and wept, and his mother rocked him in her arms through the nights and days that followed. The war had hit home for him. Young men do not realize how mortal they are until a contemporary dies. Carlo may not have been stationed long in dangerous territory, but he would become a well-known sailor through very unusual circumstances unknown to him at the time. It was VJ Day, August 14, 1945. The world was celebrating the end of the war with Japan. The streets in Times Square, New York, were jammed with thousands of people, military men and women, and civilians were cheering, hugging, and kissing every person that passed them. But no one was really a stranger that day. They were a family of Americans who had been through the worst of times and was celebrating the better times ahead. Carlo was in the middle of all the madness, doing his share of celebrating by kissing every pretty girl who passed him. A photographer, Alfred Eisenstadt, was snapping his camera at the cheerful crowd. He photographed Carlo kissing the nurse. That photograph appeared on the cover of Life magazine. Carlo found out about being on the cover when his mother came across the magazine while waiting at the doctor's office. "That's my son," she said, surprised to see him on the cover of Life magazine. She took the magazine home with her to show it to Carlo. He recognized himself in the photograph, but made little of it, beyond sharing it with friends and family. The photo of the kissing sailor became one of the most recognized images of the 20th century. Some 50 years later, a friend of Carlo wrote a letter exposing Carlo's adventure in Times Square, which brought him into the limelight at last. "We knew it had to be a Brooklyn boy," the New York headlines read. Carlo was proven to be the true kissing sailor after several sailors attempted to claim the honor. The nurse Edith Shane, who was identified some years after the photo was taken, confirmed Carlo's identity. After talking with him about how the kiss occurred, she proclaimed that he was the sailor, no doubt about it. Carlo remembered that he had seen her coming up out of the subway with another nurse. As she passed in front of him, he grabbed her in a Fred Astaire dip, kissed her long and sweet, and moved on without saying a word to her. "That's just the way it happened," said Edith. "We never said a word to each other. He was just a gentleman. The kiss was surprising, it was polite, and it was wonderful." Carlo and Edith were interviewed together several times after the media accepted them as the famous kissing duo. Carlo appeared on several television shows, including one in Italy. He never took any money for his appearances or any events regarding his connection to that photograph. As Carlo said it, those were bad times. Thousands of people died in that war, and I was a guy who had it easy compared to other men. I would never take any money for being in that picture. The kissing couple appeared at an unveiling ceremony in Times Square. The statue of their famous kiss was presented in their likeness. I've seen that photo of my uncle kissing that nurse in magazines and newspapers, on stamps, lunch pails, handbags, t-shirts, hats, jigsaw puzzles, and displayed in shopping malls and on the walls of restaurants. Every time I see it, I'm tempted to tell everyone around me, hey, that's my uncle. And sometimes I do. Carlo's contribution to the war effort was much greater than he may have realized at the time. That photo of him kissing the nurse as she passed him in the crowd of thousands represented the celebration and jubilation. It represented freedom and victory for all the men and women in the military who served their country during those terrible years of conflict. No matter where or how they served their time, most importantly, Carlo kissed that nurse for all the men who could not come home to do it themselves. That kiss represented them too. It embraced every gravestone set at the heads of brave men in cemeteries across America, Italy, and France. It represented every drop of blood shed on the battlegrounds of Europe, the Pacific Islands, and those who were lost at sea. It expressed the feeling of every soldier, sailor, and pilot lost in every war fought since. It symbolized mobility of spirit, gallantry, romance, and the happiness in coming home. That is why that photograph became so famous. It was not about a particular sailor or a nurse that he kissed. It was about what their image represented during that era. That kiss on 42nd Street and Times Square in New York City was a kiss that was felt around the world. I'm sorry. Okay, now, Uncle Harvey. Uncle Harvey was drafted. When Uncle Harvey was drafted, he was sent overseas to serve in France. He was the second lucky son to have been kept away from the lines of fire while serving his country. He worked in military camps and kitchens, cooking and serving soldiers their meals. His time in the army, like Carlo's in the Navy, was not critical. My grandfather's lucky bell had rung twice. Soon afterward, Armando received his letter. He told his father, "Hey, Pop, I've been drafted." "Ah, what are you going to do? That's at the break," he said. This was a big change from punching Jesus off the wall. Armando served in Korea as an infantry soldier trained to fight using hand-to-hand combat. They called it the Cold War, but there was nothing cold about it. Grandpa's luck had run out this time. Little did he know, when he made that wisecrack to Armando, this son would see the horrors of war, up close and personal. Grandpa had not really grown accustomed to his sons being taken away from him one by one. After all, he had worked so hard to get them. There's a story about that. Excuse me. I'm kind of teary. I hope I'm not ruining this read for you by blubbering, but I'm emotional. Okay, why he made such an aloof remark to Armando was never really understood, unless he thought unless he thought that he too would be placed in a non-combative region. But Grandpa was a soldier himself and a prisoner of war. He should have known better. War is never a safe place no matter where you are. The family worried about Armando. It seemed as if he had been away from us forever. When he finally came back home to us, he wanted to surprise everyone. So he just showed up without calling the house. I remembered that night vividly. I was sitting downstairs in the kitchen listening to Little Orphan Annie on the radio, while the family was gathered upstairs watching television. I heard the side door open and the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. I looked over to see who it was, and I saw the most beautiful sight in my world. A handsome man dressed in army greens with shiny gold buttons was standing by the threshold of the kitchen, holding a duffel bag by his side. "Uncle Miggs!" I shouted as I ran to him. "Cookie!" he yelled out. He grabbed me with the tightest hug I had ever felt from him before. I was the first piece of family that he saw when he came home from the war. And I was the first one in the family to see him. Wow, I was so happy. "Where is everybody?" he asked with a huge smile on his face. "They're upstairs watching television. Come on," I said, pulling him up the stairs, yelling out all the way to the top. "Uncle Miggs is home, Uncle Miggs is home." The family were all standing by the door at the top of the stairs when we got there. Tears were shed and jubilant screams bounced off the walls as everyone grabbed onto Armando to give him their hugs and kisses. Grandpa was happy and crying. Grandma was happy and crying. Grandpa was too. His face expressed such gratitude. He had gotten all three of his sons back safely, when many American families had not. I'm sorry. But now, my grandmother had another son to rock in her arms at night. Many restless nights, waking up screaming out the horrors of war he had expressed. He never talked about it while awake, but sleep could not keep him silent. He strived to get back to normalcy of life at home, and I do remember him doing much better after a while. Before I knew it, he was being playful again and telling me stories, wanting to suck my blood as Dracula and Igoring his silly self through the rooms. And of course, there was the howling roll of Canterbury and the mummy dragging his leg, moaning as he escaped from the Egyptian tomb. Uncle Miggs was back, and I was so glad that he was. My Uncle Miggs was my playmate, and he was the fun prankster in the family, and he always played with me, and he told the most wonderful stories, and he would act out all the characters, Dracula wanting to suck my blood, and the werewolf, dragging his leg, coming to get me, and he just played with me, and he was my biggest playmate, and I missed him so much when he was gone, and I was so young I didn't understand too much. But I'm so sorry that I'm so blubbery, but this is very sentimental. And I remember when he came home, and his bedroom was upstairs, and my mother and I had the bedroom downstairs in the finished basement off the kitchen, and it was right in the under his room, and I remember him crying out in his sleep. He'd have nightmares. And my grandmother would rock with her arms. to tell him it would be okay. And I remember that so vividly. So anyway, I'm gonna just finish up this thing. It's this reading. I've taken far too long to read it, but I have Amando's story here. I asked him many times, if he would talk to me about talking about his time in the service, and he never would. He never said much about it. As he got back to life, and he married a wonderful girl, and he had 3 sons, and he was a hard-working man. He worked with my grandfather in construction, and he never talked about it. He never wanted to. So when I had to do this book, I asked him, Armando, it's been over 50-some-odd years. Are you ready to talk to me a little bit? Because I interviewed all my family members to get their personal memories so I could document them in this book, because it was a book about family, written for family, and I wanted to get it as accurate as possible. So more than 50 years later, when I sat down to write this book, I spoke with Uncle Armando on the telephone and asked him if he would tell me what he had experienced in Korea. He still wouldn't detail the things he had done as a soldier or had witnessed happening there. It was too disturbing. However, he was able to express some of his feelings as our conversation continued, and this is what he said to me. I had a very, very tough time of it cooking, he said. It was such a tough time that I don't even want to think about it. I know it was more than 50 years ago, but sometimes it's just like it happened to me yesterday, and I don't like it. I just want to forget it. The things I did, I can never forgive myself. I did things. Why? Because the government of my country told me to do them. You get to be overcome by it. You do things that normally in a million years you would never do. You do to others, to another human being, things that you would never ever dream of doing. I saw horrible things that I still cannot get completely out of my mind. For my 75th birthday, Vera told me that she had made a hat for me with my rank and infantry number on it, and I didn't want to wear that hat. That represented the most horrible time of my life. I told him, I love you, Vera, but please don't give me that hat. I won't wear it. I want to forget about it. I'm not proud of what I did in Korea, and I'm not proud of what Korea did to me. What was your rank and infantry number? I asked him. I was in the 35th Infantry Battalion, and my rank was acting lieutenant. Acting lieutenant, I asked him. What exactly is that? That means everybody else is dead, and you're it. You take over. And that's what I did. I took over. And I watched more of my men die. What's the story? So we were getting a little hairy, so I kind of wanted to lighten it up. So I said to him, what's the story about Joe DiMaggio? Tell me about that. Joe DiMaggio's brother, Dominic. It was his brother. Yeah, I remember that, he said. He came to Korea with a guy named Mel Parnell, who was a pitcher for the Red Sox, and another guy, a little skinny guy called Billy Martin, who had just started playing second base for the Yankees. He later became the New York Yankees manager. They all came to Korea as part of a U.S. tour to give their support and help raise morale. They decided to come to the front to visit the troops, which they felt very sorry about later because there was an airstrike and they were running for their lives. It was high noon when nothing was supposed to happen. They were walking around the camp talking to us and trying to be encouraging and supportive. After about 15 minutes, the strike hit, and they almost crapped their pants running for cover. We didn't see them anymore after that. I guess they left when they got a little taste of what we were all really going through in that godforsaken place. It was nice to see that they had the guts to come there, though. Being a baseball enthusiast, it was a thrill for me to have met those guys. Armando was only 22 years old when he was drafted. He was in the service for a little over 2 years, and he spent about 16 months in Korea. When I asked him if he thought it was worth it for Americans to fight the Koreans, this is what he replied. If Korea was 90 miles off our coast, it may have been worth it, but it was 12,000 miles away. What threat were they to us at that time? Today they can reach us with their weapons, but not then. We were there because of the communists. We actually fought more Russians than the North Koreans. The Koreans were the icing on the cake. But the deep body of it was the Chinese and the Russians. They all had Russian machine guns and Russian armor. When the Chinese started surrendering, they surrendered by the hundreds. It was nothing for one man or a few men to capture 100 to 150 of them because they wanted to give up. I remember one night we were 5 of us or 6 of us hiding in the mountains. We didn't have a scrap of food to eat, not a scrap. I never felt so hungry in my life. It had been raining for days and days. We were soaking wet and freezing cold right down to our bones. We were so disgusted, we decided to put our misery before our safety, and we stripped the bark from the pine trees and got a fire going. After a while, it had gotten to be a big blaze. We stood around that fire trying to get dry. 6 starving soldiers with growling stomachs. All of a sudden, from the darkness of the hills, we heard, "Wotoshang! Wotoshang!" That means, "I surrender" in Chinese. The enemy soldiers came down from the hills with their arms in the air. They were cold, starving, wet, and miserable, just like us. They didn't want to fight anymore. They were finished. They threw their weapons down and wanted nothing more than to get by that fire and get dry. We captured about 200 enemy soldiers that night, 6 men. Captured. Ha! He laughed spontaneously. They surrendered. Did you learn any Chinese when you were there, Uncle Mays? Yeah, I learned Wo To Sheng. That's all I wanted to hear for 16 months. Wo To Sheng. I surrender. Do you remember the night you came home? I remember he said that everyone was happy that I was home. And I remember that I used to play with you in the snow. And I'd tell you stories, and we had fun. I was grateful that my uncle I'm getting blurry-eyed again. I was grateful that my uncle had talked to me about his time in the war. It brought me closure. It brought me some closure. When he was away, I wondered where he was and what he was doing. I knew he was in the war, but my only reference to the war were those violent movies I had watched on television, and they frightened me. I knew he was doing those things and that I had seen in the movies, and that enemy soldiers were shooting at him. I missed him. I worried about him. I wanted him home. He was my playmate, my horsey, my sled puller, and my storyteller. I missed his presence in my life. I was almost 5 when he left and going on 7 when he returned home. His telling me something about his experience helped satisfy my wondering, but the painful details of what happened during those years he's keeping to himself and taking with him to the grave. Everyone was glad that Armando had come home alive and without any serious injury, but I've seen what war does to people. I saw how it affected Armando for more than 50 years. And I realized that injury to a man's mind and his spirit still counts as a serious injury. And that's it. That's my little story about veterans. I'm so sorry. But the book has a lot of happy moments in it, and it has a lot of sad moments in it. And believe me, there's another story about what the family went through. It's worse than this. So have hankies ready. Okay, guys, I'm sorry it took so long for me to read this. It's, I don't know, a long, long time. Almost a half hour, I think. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't make you too weepy, as I have been. But I love my uncles, Carlo, Herbie, Armando. They all did what they did in the service, and some had it easier than others. Uncle Carlo was a submarine. He was in a submarine tender, not a submarine, but a submarine tender. I think they used to guide the subs out to open sea, and he was in the Pacific for a while. But then towards the end of the war, he was stationed in Staten Island. But Armando, he saw blood, sweat, and tears. He was hand-to-hand combat. He had to kill men. He had to watch his men killed. Watch them be blown up. He sat in foxholes, and he froze, and he got wet, and he starved, and he had shrapnel in his face and in his body. I remember that. When he came home, he had scars, and he talked about the shrapnel. Not an easy time for men and women. So that's my contribution to Remembrance Day, remembering my family in the war.